Okay, our goal for this week is to talk about forest soils, and I'm going to do that with this example study that's from eastern temperate broadleaf forests. I need to give you a little context about these forests, how they work and what they look like, and we're going to use that to link some basic soil science to our main growth limitations of forests. So we're going to go to kind of an important forest when we think about especially forest resources in the United States. And I think it's the right place to talk about forest soils because of the influence on species distributions. We're also going to use all this to explore our three main growth limitations in detail, and I'm going to bring it back to the principal. By the end of the week, we'll have brought it back to the principal limitation of California forests. So with that, let's go on. And that photograph is Tajumulco. That is not an eastern broadleaf deciduous forest. That's a high elevation pine forest, but it's a cool picture. Okay. So what are our growth limitations? Number one, the things that limit light or that limit the growth of forests are number one, light, number one, water, and number one, nutrients. They're all three tied for first. Different forests, in different forests, one or the other, or maybe a combination of these factors will be the primary limitation to growth. So all the things that we care about with forests that are related to biomass, the production of timber, the production of fiber, sequestration of atmospheric carbon, they're going to be limited by these factors. I would say that in the first at least 3 weeks of this class, if not really through the fourth week of the class, this class is about these three limitations. They're not the only factors that can put a cap on forest productivity, but they are the most common. And like I say, in different forests, one or the other is going to be most important. I also kind of, just to be complete, need to point out that biological agents and management also influence productivity as well. Anyway, that's a photograph from the broadleaf forests of Northland and New Zealand. And let's start talking about these eastern forests. These may or may not be familiar to you. I grew up on the West Coast, lived here until after college. I had crossed the Mississippi as a kid, but as an adult, I had never been to the East Coast. And I actually moved to these forests sight unseen. I don't recommend you do that. I think you should visit a place before you move there. It's just a suggestion. But anyway, I did it. It worked out fine. I really benefited from it. I was lost though, really lost. Everything looked the same. Topography was flat, wasn't as mountainous. I didn't know what I was looking at in terms of species, but with time and effort, I got it figured out. The eastern forests, especially those of New England and southern New England, they're dominated by broadleaf species. These are almost exclusively deciduous. There's a few evergreen shrubs, but they're uncommon. There's a wide range of ecological tolerances within these forests, species that are more tolerant of shade and less tolerant of shade, species that are weedier, and also species that will develop in older forests. So this photograph has American beech here. This is a broadleaf species that's common in northern forests from New England and the Maritime provinces over into at least Minnesota. I don't know that it extends over in North Dakota. I mean, maybe a little bit over there. but it's a highly shade tolerant species. It's an overstory tree. It's closely related to European beech, which is one of the most widespread trees on the continent. This photograph also has some maples, and it also has conifers. In particular, this is a closed canopy forest with it appears to be more dominated by shade tolerant species like American beech, and it's also got this conifer eastern hemlock, which is also shade tolerant. Here's a picture of me back when I was a technician at Harvard Forest, and I was a lot younger then, and I'm hanging out in the Pisgah Forest in New Hampshire. This is an old growth forest. I still have a beard. I just have more gray hair now. This is an old growth forest. Most of New England was cleared, but there are areas for one reason or another that had been minimally harvested or minimally cleared, and this is an example of one. There are some really cool trees in this forest and some big snags and stuff. It's old growth looks different on the East Coast. There isn't that much of it left. There isn't that much of it left in the whole world, but it is there. There is still some, and the characteristic that really stands out to me are the big logs and the big snags and occasional really interesting and big trees and so forth. Anyway, there's blast from the past. And here's just another photograph of a big log here. The mix of species are oaks, maples, birches, and then a couple of conifers, eastern hemlock and white pine. They all have their different ecological niches. Like I say, some are weedier, some are more associated with older systems. And the reason that I like this, the reason that I like this Bigelow paper is that it starts to break down when you see these different species and why. But let me just go over a little bit about soil. Soil is a combination of mineral, inorganic components, inorganic nutrients, a lot of silica dioxide, which is pretty inert. The minerals are all kind of, they get weathered at different rates and to different extents, and they will form these three components of soil that it's kind of been beaten into your head probably with 120, sand, silt, and clay. The other components of forest are biological, and I'm specifically talking about the things that are alive: roots, insects, a bunch of different invertebrates, and microorganisms, both the helpful and the hurtful and everything in between. And then the other thing, and that doesn't fit into the other two categories, is the organic. So these are, and here I'm talking about all the non-living, biologically derived component of the forest. So this would be dead roots, dead logs, decomposed organic material. There are soil scientists and soil biochemists who spend their entire careers, there are many people who have spent their entire careers trying to understand soil organic matter, trying to categorize it, describe it. The reason that that's worthwhile is because it is so important to the productivity of soils. So if there's one thing that, one most important thing for determining the productivity of soils, it's organic matter. This material acts like a sponge to hold water. It is also the reservoir for most of the nutrients that are limiting, the greatest amount of nutrients that are limiting to tree growth. So the answer is organic matter. It usually is. What's the most important component of soil, or I don't know if that's the right way to say it. The answer is organic matter. When I ask you the question on the midterm that's about soil productivity, water, and nutrient capacity, holding capacity? The answer is organic matter. I'll tell you the answer now. That's what I'm supposed to do, right? This is lecture. The answer is organic matter. It's the obvious thing. Anyway, this is a photograph from Chiapas, and you can see that there's a couple of different qualities of soil here. This is just a road cut, but the dark soil that you're seeing there is soil that's high in organic matter, and that's soil that has more nutrients and a better water holding capacity than the adjacent soils. Soil quality, oftentimes a function of organic matter. Here's just a little bit of a little bit more detail about soils and soil carbon. Not all soils store carbon equally. You may be aware that more carbon is stored in soils than living organic matter. Lots of the carbon that ends up accumulating in soils is it's really complex, and it's very difficult for microbes to break down. So some of it essentially gets locked into soils. Yeah, the average the average carbon volume increases from the tropics to the boreal forest and tundra, and that's also because it decomposes more slowly. So you get up into the tundra areas, and that organic matter actually, it becomes unavailable because it just remains frozen all year. I did get to go up to the tundra right after I graduated from college. I think I mentioned that maybe previously. And I got to see some of these this gelisol, they're called gelisols. They're Arctic soil, they're underlaid by permafrost. They've got terrible drainage. They're actually a really boggy place in the summer that's difficult to move around and practically impossible to dig a hole. If you need to sample this permafrost, you do it with a drill. That's pretty wild. You know, you drill like a core, and then you can sample it, you know, to look at its carbon content and so forth. What makes a good soil? Well, it needs the right amount of water holding capacity. So generally, high quality soils or highly productive soils have some clay, they have some water retention, but they have some sand, or they're a loam. They have enough silt. There needs to be adequate nutrients, primarily nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Although in some ecosystems, calcium can be more important. There needs to be there needs to be a microbial community to support the cycling of nutrients here as well. Like I say, nutrient pools are oftentimes a function of organic matter content, although especially in some forest ecosystems, organic matter content can end up kind of working in both ways, being a positive component of soil and also changing the storage of inorganic nutrients. And the reason for that is because organic matter, particularly leaf litter, tends to be fairly acidic, and that can strip nutrients out of soils. This photograph here is of what's called a spodosol, and that's a soil that's very uncommon, very rare in California, but common on the East Coast. What happens is you get all this, organic matter that accumulates on the forest floor, and it's really acidic, so it leaches all the nutrients out of the soil here. And the reason this is gray is because it's stripped of all its organic matter and nutrients, and that actually ends up accumulating in deeper soil horizons. Just kind of a quirky thing that happens with these forests sometimes. Okay, again, some review, we'll just go through this very quickly. Plants are limited by different nutrients. The principal ones that they need in the highest supply tend to be the most limiting are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. Nitrogen is important in protein formation, and phosphorus is a component of nucleic acids, as well as the molecular storage of energy in ATP. Plants need potassium and calcium to form structures within their cells and maintain osmotic gradients. And interesting, magnesium, critical component of chlorophyll structure, and sulfur for proteins, and then there's a bunch of micronutrients that generally are not limiting. It would be very uncommon that this would have to be added to soil, although if you can figure out a way to keep any boron out of a soil, you can actually introduce a boron limitation here for most plants. It's kind of exotic, but it's real. And this, of course, is just a picture of Miracle-Gro, and that's just to remind myself and remind you that if you add these nutrients, particularly if you add the macronutrients, you can increase the growth of plants. That's true for forests as well as anything else. Yes, please, Anna. Oh, yeah, okay, no, cool.
Sorry, that was my mom just trying to talk to me, and I had to tell her I was in class.
Cool. Anyway, that's that stuff. It's probably a review. And, you know, these, there are different kinds of the soils tend to reflect what is growing above them. There is, oh, and this is the thing that I wanted to kind of, the reason to show this here is to remind myself that the way that I want to talk about soils for our class is to think about them, at least for a little while, as a coupled system. The soils are an extension of what we see above ground. And what happens above ground affects what goes on in the soils and vice versa. That's the useful perspective for us. Okay, so let's talk about Seth Bigelow's study here. The reason that I think that this is worth there's a number of reasons why I think this is worth muddling our way through. It's a pretty technical paper. Like I said, I think it's the most technical, the driest of the stuff that we read for this class. But it's hard to find a study that covers the breadth of this forest type. And in particular, something that I certainly hadn't experienced growing up in ponderosa pine forests, and something that you might experience as well if most of your training is in the Cal Poly, you know, around Cal Poly. You might think all forests are dominated by coast live oak and they have a couple of bay laurel in them. I kind of felt that's how I felt about forests. You know, there's ponderosa pine and there's a couple of, you know, oaks, and that's that. But most forests are more diverse than that. And this is a great example of that. Eastern forests have, I would say that they have 8 to 10 or maybe 12 dominant species. So what influences where each of those species are most prevalent? And part of the answer lies in the availability of nutrients, variation in soil quality, and particularly the characteristics of soil that determine the availability of nutrients, not just moisture in this case, but actually mineral nutrients. And the other thing that's you kind of need to know about eastern forests in particular, I kind of alluded to this, is that the soils tend to be acidic. That's because of the vegetation, but also because of low levels of pollution, acid deposition in these ecosystems. And the pH of the soil, the amount of a soil acidity, influences the availability of different nutrients. And the point of this graph is to point out that different nutrients are responding to changes in pH differently. So calcium becomes more available at high pHs. That's in part because there's probably more of it. And things like ammonium become more available at low pHs. And that can happen for two reasons. One, ammonium will acidify soil, but ammonium and particularly nitrate don't bind as tightly to soil as other mineral nutrients. And it means that they will get knocked off, especially by hydronium, that free hydrogen that's available, that influences soil pH. So these things are going, point of this is that these different nutrients are going in different directions. And that creates a kind of ecological heterogeneity that we need to support multiple dominant overstory species. The last thing to point out here is about aluminum. And again, this is something that might seem kind of exotic from our perspective here, our West Coast perspective. I don't know how much discussion there was about aluminum in your Soils 120 class, but I had never thought about it. I had never thought about aluminum influencing forests or being something that was worth thinking about in terms of soils until I got to the East Coast. And it turns out that aluminum, which has many different forms within soils, can interact with pH and interact with nutrient availability in ways that determine what species are going to be dominant at a site. The last thing I want to point out about aluminum is that it's not a nutrient. So far as I know, there's no biological limitation because of aluminum in soils. And we're talking about low levels. There's not like a lot of it, you can't mine it or something like that in these soils, but it's much higher than we experience in California, especially certain forms of it that make it more freely available on soils. And it will compete for binding sites on soils and influence the availability of certain nutrients. So it matters, even though it's not actually a nutrient. And what ends up happening, in particular, what you can see, this is six of the main species here. And if you're not familiar with these are sugar maple, Acer sicarium, that's where you get maple syrup from. Fraxinus americana, that's an ash species. We got Fagus grandifolia, that's our American beech. Acer rubrum, probably the most common and fastest growing maple in the East Coast, red maple. And Quercus rubra, which is eastern red oak, and then Tsuga canadensis, which is eastern hemlock. And what you can see here is you got eastern hemlock, which is associated with the most acidic soils, and then you've got the maples that are tend to be more associated with more basic soils, especially sugar maple. And sugar maple is important for production of maple syrup, but it's also can be really, really valuable timber. If you can grow it straight, it can be used in many different applications. So there's a reason to care about it beyond just production of maple syrup. And then there's variation that you can see among the other species. The ashes tend to be associated with higher pH soils, and then there's a range of variation for oaks and beech. Take-home point, and it's especially true in this case, nutrients are driving the composition of soils here, or driving the composition of forests. And that's not to say that moisture doesn't matter. And in fact, nutrients are the only thing that influences the dynamics of forests here. These are very closed canopy forests. There's a lot of tree cover in these locations. And however, when canopies are intact in these eastern forests, lots of the competition is driven by nutrients. That's the main point here. It's got a particular context, but it has relevance to us trying to understand what species are occurring where and why. I'd like to cover this figure. How many of you are familiar with multivariate concepts? Blind cloaks, right on. Okay, what do I mean by a multivariate concept? We experience the world in 3 spatial dimensions and a 4th dimension of time. Our minds have a very difficult time picturing anything more than 3 dimensions. We just don't have a reference for it. But real systems are a combination of many, many, many different interactions. So they have a dimensionality that is more than 3 dimensions. They don't exist in some sort of hyper-dimensional space, but their ecological interactions are multi-dimensional. So many times, if we're trying to understand, in this case, we have many different nutrients and chemical characteristics of the soil that are influencing what trees we see. This is a multi-dimensional problem. It is a multivariate problem. And the reason for this graph, and if you didn't spend much time on it, I don't blame you. It's real. It took me a long time, a lot of thinking, and a lot of hard work to try to get to the point where I can get something out of these figures. What this is, it's an attempt to take something that has 10 dimensions and put it into a readable 2-dimensional space. We actually confront this problem in our lab. We will do the most basic multi-dimensional analysis, and that's a correlation analysis. I'm not sure, I'll come back to this later about whether you've actually done a correlation analysis, but we have a data set that has maybe 10 factors. And one of the exercises is to show give you a tool for weeding through all of these interactions to figure out which ones are important. This is what Seth has done in his paper, and this is just it's a statistical procedure called, I think this one was principal components. Doesn't matter. Except it's just a tool for taking all of this complex set of interactions and then put it into something that is more readable. I'm not going to say that this is especially readable. It's not easy to get through even when you're trained to do it. But it's the best tool that we have right now. I will say that. Here are some of the things that you can get out of this, and the most obvious thing is that aluminum and pH are on different sides of this, are going in opposite directions. What that's showing is the influence of aluminum on pH. These things are very strongly correlated. That they're in a straight line, that they're far apart, suggests that they are strongly correlated and that they are negatively correlated. The other lines are going more at right angles, and the term for that is that they are orthogonal, and that means that they are not correlated. They're more like, yeah, it's sort of like, that's the best way I can put it. They just have a different relationship. Whereas something like magnesium and calcium, those are very tightly correlated as well, but they're positively correlated. Anyway, I think that's the best that I'm probably going to be able to do for you with this. Multi-dimensional analysis, like I said, we're going to do a little. Otherwise, if you need it, it's the sort of topic that you'll dive into and that you'll train yourself to do. Please, Joe.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. According to the article, magnesium and calcium were positively correlated with pH. And so is this demonstrating that? And then it's showing that potassium, and then is that ammonium, NH, or ammonia?
It is, it's ammonia, yeah.
Is that negatively correlated with pH according to this?
It would be negatively correlated, yeah. And the degree at which it's at a right angle, it tells you something about how strong that correlation is. Mm-hmm. Sometimes what happens is because it has many different dimensions, correlations can get hidden in there. And there's, I can't remember if the term rotation, I think they talked about rotating the axes here. And what that does is you kind of take this whole data set, you can rotate it, and you can see when different correlations come out. So I don't think that this graph gives you a little bit of insight into that positive relationship between magnesium, calcium, and pH. But I think it's actually kind of hidden in there. Took me a long time to feel like I could look at these and get something out of them. I've actually gotten to the point where I use them now. And they're still it's hard to get them to the point where you can actually get something out of them. But we're stuck with it. We're stuck with it. There are many, many different problems in the natural sciences that are multidimensional. And here's a cool example. Do you remember this from last year? This is a picture of a black hole. I can't remember how far away it is. It's the Event Horizon Telescope image. It was just like a major achievement. What they had to confront was a multidimensional problem. In particular, one of the big challenges with developing this image was teasing out all of the noise, all of the information that was actually dust and gas and all this stuff that's in between our perspective here on Earth and this object in deep space. They, I think collecting the data was probably the easy part, and then the hard part was teasing it all apart, teasing the noise out of it. And a lot of the ways that they did that were through multidimensional analyses. Whenever you have many interactions, and especially whenever you have many weak interactions, that's where you need multidimensional analysis. And if there's one thing that physics and ecology have in common, it is an abundance of weak interactions, weak effects, many different processes that add little bits of power, of effect on something that we are interested in. So each one of those nutrients is a small effect on the forest, on forest growth or forest dominance. Every single characteristic of the soil, every little fine characteristic of the soil or fine characteristic of the stand are small effects that create what we see. It would be very uncommon for you to find one effect that explains everything about the dynamics or the structure of forests. That's what you're in for. There are usually no simple answers in ecology. But don't worry, that's why it's worth doing. The good problems are the hard ones. Okay, there's kind of to bring this back a little bit more for us. This is one of the main points that I kind of want to make with our discussion about soils, and that's just are there management applications? Can we manipulate soils in particular or other stand conditions to increase growth or favor species or certain structure? And the answer is yes. If you understand the limitations on growth, oftentimes you can do something about it. For example, forests respond positively to fertilization. And in some settings, it may be worthwhile to actually fertilize stands. There are in some plantation silviculture, it's worth adding nitrogen. It's an easy thing to do, especially fertilizers like urea are fairly slow release. Not that much of it will end up in the waterways, and they're fairly cheap. So it may be, you may be in revenue positive territory by adding fertilizer in some cases. There's a place for that. Yes, Joe.
Is that common outside of uneven age stands? Or I'm sorry, is that common outside of even age stands, like plantations and stuff?
I wouldn't think so.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. And the reason, I think there would be more fertilization that would be done if it changed species composition. But it doesn't. It doesn't change species composition on the time scale that's relevant for production forestry. So, usually when you see fertilization, it is in a plantation context. And, I would say furthermore that doing plantation forestry doing some of it can be a really great way to practice sustainable forestry. If you have areas where you can grow trees pretty fast, and that allows you to keep other stands in reserve, say to not harvest your old growth or to keep stands that have some sort of, kind of unique biodiversity and so forth, that's a real positive thing. So is there some environmental costs with doing fertilization? There certainly can be. And it certainly can be an expense that in production forestry you might want to avoid, and sometimes you might be better off avoiding. But there's a place for it too. Most of the time, and most of what I tend to emphasize when talking about the dynamics of forests are the influence and limitation of light and water. And those two factors can be readily influenced through stand thinning. So most of what you're going to do, your main set of tools for managing forests is going to be removing individual trees. It's going to be the saw. Removing individual species that are not necessarily your target, your management targets, or reducing density of stands altogether in order to reduce the limitations of light and water. Sorry. Oh, geez.